In this module, we're going to be talking about personality and social knowledge. How is your personality, the person that you are, related to things that you know or think you know or believe about the world around you? We're going to talk about two different topics. The first is judging other people's personalities, and the second is self and other. How does your understanding of yourself relate to your understanding of the social world? Now, a lot of people are interested in first impressions. First impressions are an important topic in applying for jobs, for example, where you might meet an employer and they might have to decide whether they're going to hire you based on meeting you just once. First impressions are important in the social world when you meet people for the first time. And personality psychologists have been very interested in this question of first impressions. How well do you have to know somebody to know their personality? Can a stranger guess somebody's personality traits from a brief first impression? Is it possible to guess somebody's personality if you never meet them at all? Now, early research on first impressions focused on brief meetings when people met one another and exchanged very minimal information, sometimes just saying their name and shaking somebody's hand. And then the researchers would separate people, send them to different rooms, give them a questionnaire and say, what do you think this person's personality is like? And they would compare that to what the person said about themselves, or what people who know them well said, or to what psychological assessments said. And from this early research on brief face-to-face meetings, what the research found was that from a very brief meeting, it's possible to make better than chance guesses about how extroverted somebody is and about how conscientious they are. So just from saying, hi, my name is Bob, shaking somebody's hand and then walking away, they'll get a little bit of an impression, better than random chance, a somewhat accurate impression of how outgoing you are and how organized and industrious you are. It's a little harder to guess from a first impression how open to experience someone is, how agreeable they are, or how neurotic they are. From this early work, researchers then began to expand out and say, well, what about other kinds of contexts? What happens if you meet somebody online? What happens if you never meet somebody at all, but you go to their office or their home and look around? And the answer is that from a lot of different contexts, we can get a surprising amount of information. So as I said, from brief meetings, we can guess people's extroversion and conscientiousness. From research by Sam Gosling, he found that people's living spaces, like bedrooms and homes, make it possible to guess how open and conscientious somebody is. Seeing just a photograph of somebody, not even meeting them at all, just seeing a photo, it makes it possible to guess how extroverted someone is. And it's possible from browsing somebody's Facebook page to accurately infer how open to experience and extroverted they are. Now, how do people do this? Well, researcher David Funder has developed what he called the realistic accuracy model that shows all the steps that are necessary in order for people to form accurate impressions of somebody else's personality. So the path from a target person's personality attributes to a perceiver's judgment has to go through 4 different stages. The first of these is what Funder called relevance. And here the idea is that a personality trait, in order to be perceived accurately, must give rise to relevant behavioral cues. And so when you think back to something like extroversion in the context of a first meeting, extroversion has to relate to something that people do or are in that meeting. So for example, maybe it's how much they smile or how much they talk or some other body language. Those relevant cues have to be available to observers. And so across these different areas of research, you can see how in first meetings, for example, different kinds of information might be available to others than are available on somebody's Facebook page or in their home. Now that takes care of the target side. Targets have to have relevant behaviors related to their personalities, and those behaviors have to be made available in the environment. From a perceiver's perspective, the perceiver has to be able to detect those cues. So it must be possible for people to notice them. If something goes by too quickly, or if something goes by outside of someone's attention, then they won't be able to be accurate. And finally, perceivers have to utilize the cues correctly. So in some cases, people might detect cues, but they might use them in the wrong way. They might think that, for example, how many CDs or books somebody has on their bookshelf is indicative of how open to experience they are, when it turns out that that's not related to openness at all. What really matters is the variety, how many different kinds they have, not how many they have. From the target side, when we're looking at someone's personality and what kinds of information people make available, Sam Gosling's work has suggested that there are two broad categories of information. The first is what Gosling calls behavioral residue. These are unintentional consequences of ordinary behaviors. So, for example, if you walk into somebody's office and you're trying to guess what they're like, if they're low in conscientiousness, their office might be kind of messy. Or if you're trying to guess somebody's personality from a photograph, someone who smiles and laughs a lot, like an extrovert, might, especially as they get a little bit older, have laugh lines on the face, wrinkles that are indicative of having smiled a lot over the course of their life. Another category of information that people present to others is what are called identity claims. These aren't unintentional consequences. These are things that people do on purpose to declare who they are. So in an office or a bedroom, people might display posters and photographs of family and friends, or posters of political causes. And in judging somebody's personality from a picture, their choice of clothing and how they groom themselves might be indicative of something about their personality. Now, other research on personality perception has looked at the question of who's the most accurate. Do people know themselves the best, or do other people around them know the best? And in a 2010 study by Samin Vazir, she tried to sort this out. So for this experiment, Samin Vazir recruited a sample of participants and asked them all to self-report their personality traits. And then she also asked them to nominate friends who know them well and ask their friends, what do you think this person's personality is like? And then finally, she introduced them to total strangers and asked the strangers to guess, what do you think this person is like? And the question Vazir had was, who knows somebody's personality the best? The self-report, the friends, or the strangers? In order to test this, she had the participants then complete standardized laboratory assessments of personality that would tell the researchers how extroverted somebody is, how neurotic they are, and what their level of intellect is. And she compared the self, friends, and strangers on these different assessments of personality. Her hypothesis was that strangers and friends would be as good or better than the self for traits that are highly observable. So for something like extroversion, which is based primarily in observable behavior and behaving in an outgoing way and talking to others, that friends and even strangers would be able to judge this pretty well. Whereas things that are less observable, like neuroticism, would be hard for strangers and friends to judge. Vazir also hypothesized that friends would be better than the self for traits that are highly evaluative, because the self has a lot of biases. We're really invested in wanting to think highly of ourselves, and so we may be distorted. And so for intellect, she hypothesized that friends would be better than the self. And what she found was consistent with these hypotheses. So for neuroticism, the best judge of somebody's level of neuroticism was the self. The self outperformed friends, outperformed strangers. For extroversion, everybody was about the same. The self, friends, and strangers were all equally good. But for intellect traits, friends were the best. Friends know somebody's intellect better than the self and better than strangers. Okay, let's talk about self and other. So when we talk about your personality, we're not just talking about your traits. We're also talking about beliefs and knowledge that you have about the social world. That's an important part of who you are too. The social cognitive approach to personality really takes this as the heart of what personality is about. The emphasis from a social cognitive approach is not so much on traits as it is on understanding how people think about themselves in the social world. That's really who you are. You are your mind, you are your way of understanding the world. Personality consists of the beliefs that drive your thoughts, feelings, and actions. An early attempt to try to understand personality from this kind of a social cognitive approach was from a researcher named George Kelly, who developed a personality test he called the REP test to try to get at what kinds of concepts people use to make sense of themselves in the social world. So the way the REP test worked was you went through a series of repetitions. That's why it's called the REP test. And each time you were asked to think of 3 people, and they would be 3 different people each time. But I want you to do just one round of it with me to get a sense of what it's like. So imagine I say to you, think of 3 different people. Think of yourself. Think of an old friend, somebody you've known for a very long time. And think of somebody you work with or go to school with who isn't the old friend. So 3 different people. Now, I want you to think of some way in which two of those three people are similar to each other, but different from the third. So you might think of what's something that's similar about you and your friend and your old friend and different from the person you work with, or similar about you and the person you work with, but different from the friend, and so forth. So I'll give you an example of this for myself. Here in the slide you can see that's me in the top right. That's my friend Eric on the right. He's an old friend of mine. And that's somebody I work with on the left, Sarah. And so if I were doing this rep test, I might say, okay, what do me and Eric have in common that's different from Sarah? I might think about it for a while and say, well, you know, Eric and I are both a little bit disorganized, but Sarah's very organized. She always meets her deadlines on time and gets everything taken care of right away. And so I might say, well, organized and disorganized. That's the concept that I'm using here. Now, Kelly's idea was that if you went through this exercise enough times with different combinations of three people every time, that patterns and themes would start to emerge. So his theory suggests that each individual has a unique way of perceiving and interpreting the world, and that's an important part of your personality. What he called your personal constructs, which are the ways that you describe, predict, and explain your own and other people's behavior. So as you go through this rep test, this is a way of eliciting your personal constructs, finding out what do you notice and think about in yourself and others. And so in my own example, I said organized versus disorganized. And the idea is that if that came up over and over again in this rep test, then that says something about me. I really care about knowing whether people are organized or disorganized, for example. And that's an important personal construct for me, according to Kelly. So this was really an early attempt to try to get at the way people think about the social world. In more recent years, researchers have focused on a lot of other kinds of beliefs that drive personality. One of the most important of these is self-esteem. This has received a lot of focused attention from research, and self-esteem is defined as the evaluative component of the self-concept. So it's somebody's sense of whether they're basically good or basically bad. So from a questionnaire that's commonly used to measure self-esteem, you might be asked, how much do you agree or disagree with statements like, I take a positive attitude toward myself, I certainly feel useless at times, which if you agree with that would be indicative of low self-esteem. On the whole, I'm satisfied with myself. And so based on how people answer questions or how people respond to statements like these, researchers can calculate somebody's self-esteem score and get a sense of whether they view themselves in a positive or negative light. Research has found that self-esteem varies over the lifespan. It starts off relatively high in childhood. You can see on the left of this figure, it drops during adolescence. So teenagers tend to suffer from declining self-esteem on average. But then during adulthood, it starts to go up, and starting around in the 40s or so, the average person's self-esteem gets higher and higher until the 60s, and then tends to decline a bit in later life as people have diminished capacity. A lot of research has gone into trying to understand whether high self-esteem causes good outcomes. One of the challenges of this work is distinguishing correlation from causation. So we know from a lot of studies that high self-esteem is moderately correlated with good outcomes, which is to say there's a positive correlation between self-esteem and things like school performance, occupational success, and mental health, especially the absence of depression. And the question is, what's causing what? Is high self-esteem causing these outcomes? Or are these things causing high self-esteem? Or is there something else that's causing both of them? And as researchers have dug deeper, they found a lot of complexities. So, for example, high-functioning people who do quite well, have high self-esteem. But so do narcissists, people that have an unrealistically high and an even pathologically high sense of self-esteem, who often have problems in their social and work lives. And experiments that have tried to boost people's self-esteem in order to see whether there's cause and effect have had mixed results at best. There really has not been consistent evidence that boosting people's self-esteem causes good outcomes. It more seems to be that self-esteem is correlated with and maybe a consequence of good outcomes. Based on this research, a psychologist named Mark Leary has developed what he called sociometer theory. The proposal of sociometer theory is that self-esteem isn't a cause of good outcomes, it's an outcome itself. And Leary's proposal is that self-esteem may be an adaptation that we have, a way of measuring how well we're maintaining a sense of connection and belonging with others. So it's a meter of our social standing, hence the name sociometer. And through a series of experiments and naturalistic observations, Leary and other researchers have found that when people are doing relatively well in social situations, that causes their self-esteem to go up. And when they're having difficulties relating to and interacting with others, their self-esteem goes down. Now, some people have broken sociometers. Narcissists are an example of this, where their self-esteem just stays high and it doesn't seem to change depending on how they're doing. And that may be actually a cause of the kinds of problems that narcissists have. They can't tell when they're alienating other people or behaving inappropriately because their sociometers are broken. They feel good about themselves even when they're doing bad things. And conversely, some people have problems because they have highly sensitive sociometers. So in research looking at this sociometer theory and the strength of different people's sociometers, people who are high in the big five trait of neuroticism or people who have an anxious attachment style have very sensitive sociometers. They have plunging self-esteem every time they feel slightly excluded from a group. Now, what are the implications of this work? Well, if you're interested in self-esteem, we know that it's important to measure because it tells us something about what's going on in people's lives, but it has to be interpreted in context. Simply trying to get people to have high self-esteem or assuming that high self-esteem is always good isn't going to give us a very clear picture. This research also suggests that if we want to help people, help kids in schools, for example, or help adults, we shouldn't necessarily focus on trying to boost self-esteem itself. Rather, we should look to be boosting the things that lead to self-esteem, helping people achieve, helping people to have close and meaningful relationships.